Hi, and welcome to the Psych, Health and Safety podcast. My name is Jason Banshee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I'm a little nervous to say because Will might make fun of me.
Will, our social media manager, if you could call him that. Work experience kid, maybe. I don't know.
Well, maybe not for long if he keeps that up.
He should know who he's dealing with.
He should. But, then he probably didn't know that he was being narked on either. So.
Yeah, that's right. No, It's not good when your dad is your boss as
well.
No.
I'm good. I had a nice relaxing weekend. I've been reading a new book that I'm enjoying. So, feeling good.
Yeah, terrific. What book is that?
It is called One Damn Thing After Another.
Sounds like right down your alley.
Yeah, it's a bit like my life, except there's more like time travel and dinosaurs and murder and stuff involved. So none of that in my life, thankfully. But I go to an independent bookstore mostly because it's the closest one to my house, but also the guy who owns it gives me really, really good recommendations on books. So he's like, oh, well, what do you like to read? And I'll give him a list of stuff that I'm into at the moment, and he'll just go and like pluck something off the shelf, and it's just delightful. So
yeah, great.
Yeah.
Well, I just got back from a week family holiday for Easter and managed to get through 2 novels. So I very rarely read, as you know. And it was, I really loved reading when I was a kid. And it was good to get into a couple of good fantasy fiction novels.
Yep. Good to unwind.
Yes, well, this is a show not about reading books, but about psych, health and safety.
It
so
is.
we should probably introduce our guests.
I suppose.
Yeah, so first of all, we've got 2 guests today. Dr. Joan Cahill is a research fellow and principal investigator at the Centre for Innovation in Human Systems at the School of Psychology at the Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. And Paul Cullen is both an Airbus A320 captain and research associate at the college. Welcome to the podcast to you both.
Hi, and thank you for having us, Jason and Joelle.
Yeah, well, we've just experienced our first technical mishap with 2 people with outside the 5-kilometre radius, with both answering the question at the same time. So we will get smoother, no doubt, as the podcast goes.
All right. So the first thing that we like to ask, as you know, is about your favourite podcast. So I'll go to you first, Joan. What do you like to listen to?
Well, I suppose being honest, I don't listen to a whole lot of podcasts. If I'm out for a walk, it's really silence or the birds. But sometimes I listen to Melvin Bragg on BBC Radio 4, so the In Our Time show, which is podcast, and it's really excellent. Covers everything from philosophy to books to music, and his guests are always really interesting.
Good. And Paul, what do you like to listen to?
I'll be honest, I haven't been listening to a whole lot of podcasts for the last year. I used to use my commute in and out to work as an opportunity to listen to podcasts. But the only podcast I've been listening to of late is actually this podcast. I came across it through Peter Kelly, and I've listened to every episode. I found it absolutely fantastic. But before I came across you guys, I was listening to a lot of Todd Conklin, pre-accident investigations. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Yep.
The safety of work, obviously. I used to love actually listening to the first minute or 2 of the safety of work and find out which paper the guys are going to review. I'd go get that paper. I'd have a read of it. And then I'd realize how much of the paper I actually misunderstood when I listened to the 2 guys dissect the paper. And I'd also be a big fan of TED Talks. I like to do a lucky dip on TED Talks, just randomly pick one and listen to it for 10 or 15 minutes. Russell Brand, Under the Skin, I find fascinating. I think Russell Brand is hilarious. He's an absolute genius in my mind, totally misunderstood. And then another lesser known podcast I listen to a lot is the Work Well podcast. It's an Irish-based podcast produced by one of my colleagues in Trinity College, a guy by the name of Brian Crook. I'd well recommend the podcast to anyone. It's very focused on the secondary interventions and how to implement meaningful strategies rather than your random acts of wellness into the workplace. So that's basically my podcast that I listen to.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, terrific. And you can definitely come back again,
Yeah.
Paul, if this is one of the regular podcasts that you listen to. That's great. In fact, Brian has already reached out to us, and at some point we might be able to do a crossover episode with the two podcasts, which would be great.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. So tell us about your professional careers to date, maybe starting with you, Joan.
Okay, it's been very positive, actually. That's the first thing. My work is in the space of human factors, behaviour science and ethics, and I'm working at Trinity College in Dublin in the School of Psychology, and I've been there for the last 20 years, working across aviation, healthcare, road transport, and various other areas. And that's really the main areas of my research are looking at human issues, looking at the person. So the person in the workplace, any aspects of the person in the system.
Yeah. Okay. And what are some of the things that you have been doing in the past, Paul? I mean, you're at the research assistants now at the college now, but where did you start?
I started my flying career 23 years ago. And for most of the last 23 years, I've just been a pilot. I've always been very inquisitive. I was always someone ever since I was a young child who would ask why, followed by another why, followed by another why. Back in 2011, I got involved with the Safety and Technical Committee in the Irish Airline Pilots Association. And quite soon, I took over that committee as Director of Safety and Technical. I was in that role up until 2013. And during that time, I worked quite closely with our peer support program. And I became quite alarmed at the number of guys who were coming to the peer support group with problems. But it wasn't just the number of guys, it was the type of problems they were coming with. Like I was of the opinion that we were cut from the same cloth as astronauts. So therefore, if these guys were psychometrically screened in the same way as I was, none of us should be suffering problems because we were special. We weren't just the general population. We were the chosen few who had the right stuff. And over the last number of years, I've actually come to realize that that's bullshit. None of us are special. So if there's any pilots out there and you think you're special, maybe now is the time to tune out because you're going to find this podcast very disappointing. And I started back in 2014 after I left the committee to do my own research. I was trying to find out why it was that some of these guys were struggling. Like, what was it? How were they slipping through the net and getting into the system where, in my mind, they probably shouldn't have been because they were possibly flawed. So how were we recruiting these guys that were broken? And over time, I realized that they weren't the problem. That they're actually the same as all of us. And that we all are susceptible to those problems. And what we have in common is we're all working and living in this bubble. And that within that bubble, we've normalized deviant behavior. And the way in which pilots work is wrong. And it's not natural. And there's a lot of factors about how we work that's decimating our physical and our mental and our social health. I started to try to do a literary review, and I found that there was very little research, especially very little current research on airline pilots. There was a lot done on the military, but very little on commercial airline pilots. So I started, what I didn't realize at the time was my own preliminary organic field research. I spoke to over 100 pilots and asked them about their experience of being a pilot and what was it, I used to call it pains in the ass. What was it that was causing them a pain in the ass about the job? And I had a little notebook and I'd write in words, and I started to see that certain themes were repeating. Stuff like the irregular hours, working weekends, working long duties, difficulties getting leave during the summertime, and the sedentary nature of the job. But I started seeing that there was a pattern developing. Now, at the time, I was working with Joan on a separate project, a human factors project, looking at autopilots and automation. And Joan knew I was interested in this, but neither of us really had any expertise in this area at the time. And then Germanwings happened. An airplane with 150 people on board crashed into the Alps. And it turned out that the co-pilot, who was seriously mentally unwell, deliberately crashed the airplane, killing everyone. And the European authorities went to great lengths to try prevent this kind of thing ever happening again. And on foot of that, 3 main rules were put in place. That pilots would have to be psychometrically screened at the start of their career. there would also have to be random alcohol and intoxicant testing, and there would have to be peer support programs implemented. But from the very start, when that was announced, I was thinking to myself, that's not going to prevent pilots developing mental health problems. That's actually going to do more damage than good, because it's a witch hunt. It's how do we get the pilots who have problems and get them out of cockpits, rather than how do we support the pilots who have the problems. So I fear that would drive the pilots who have the problems underground, and it would do nothing to prevent pilots from developing problems. And when I looked at how risk is managed in aviation in general, it defied all logic what was being done around mental health. And in aviation, we use predominantly a mix of preventative and reactive risk measures. Now, I've always compared mental health to mountains. Are you familiar with the cartoonist Gary Larson and the Far Side cartoons, the satirical comics?
Yeah.
There's a very good cartoon that I've used in almost every presentation we've given. And it's two pilots sitting in the cockpit. They look out the window and they see a mountain goat in the cloud bank. And one says to the other, "Hey, what's a mountain goat doing up here in the clouds?" Obviously, they've no idea where they are. And I compare that analogy of mountains. Like when we think back to the 50s and 60s, airplanes were slamming into the sides of mountains at an alarming rate. They didn't bulldoze the mountains. What they did was they made sure the pilots knew where the mountains were. So they gave the pilots maps. And on the maps, the mountains were charted. And then that still wasn't enough, because the pilots knew where the mountains were, but they didn't know where they were in relation to the mountains. So then they beefed up the navigation on the airplanes. So the pilots knew where the mountains were, and they knew where they were in relation to the mountains. So the mountains are a hazard. And that still wasn't enough. And then in the 70s and 80s, we introduced technology onto the aircraft called ground proximity warning systems. This is the technology that screams at the pilots, like too low, terrain. And once that was introduced, that was a game changer. There's been very, very few incidents involving aircraft flying into mountains since then. Well, unintentionally flying into mountains. And I think we need to identify the mountains in pilots' lives, the aspects of the job that potentially can cause them a problem, and give them effectively a map and say, these are where the mountains are. You need to fly away from them. And at the last resort, if you can't fly away from them, you have your GPWS, your ground proximity warning system, which is the pull up. But that's the peer support program. That's the alcohol intoxicant testing. That's the psychometric screening. And I would say that where are the measures been put in place? The maps. Who is highlighting to pilots what the hazards of the jobs are and what measures they can put in place? So it's all tertiary interventions. You have your EAP, your peer support, your random drug testing. There's no primary interventions. There's no secondary interventions. And that's what I'm trying to do. And I think of the quote from Desmond Tutu, where he says that we need to get to a stage where we stop pulling people out of the river, and we have to go upstream and find out why they're falling into the river in the first place. And that's not been done. And the focus of our research for the last 4 or 5 years has not only been to look at susceptibility and suffering, it's to look at resilience. So why are some pilots doing okay? Because at the end of the day, the vast majority of pilots are actually coping. Like, we are coping, and I think coping is the key word. And that's where Joan has really been focusing and looking on what it is that allows some pilots to cope.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things is, as Paul mentions, the Germanwings disaster. I mean, it's a huge tragedy, but one of the problems that arose from this was not just the reactive response, but in terms of how the problem of well-being was framed. So, the problem of well-being was framed as avoiding these kinds of scenarios in the future. And actually, when we looked at and interviewed pilots and surveyed pilots, we've actually, developed an evidence map which suggests that the problem is multi-leveled, and there's factors both at an individual and an organizational level that contribute either to positive well-being or mental health problems, or burnout, and these different kinds of things. And you can't just focus at the individual. You do need to look at the organizational level, and beyond that, you certainly need to look at the regulator, because I suppose in their defense, some organizations are doing more or less in the space of well-being, but many of them are just responding to the requirements that the regulator has laid down in terms of fitness for work. So, and so the regulator has a role and a responsibility here as well. And equally, so does society and government. So it's in terms of how we look at the problem of well-being more generally. And this has been a big part of our research. We've actually learned a lot about coping and coping mechanisms. And unfortunately, with the Germanwings disaster, and I mean, there's evidence for other kinds of negative outcomes, not necessarily as severe, where people have looked at mental ill health, and they haven't necessarily looked at promoting positive well-being and flourishing, which we know that you're interested in. And so the conversation needs to be slightly different. It needs to include different dimensions. So as Paul mentions, we need to look at promoting positive well-being. We need to also look at preventative or proactive approaches. And then we need to look and help those who are suffering. And we know with COVID now, there's quite a few people suffering, particularly those who've lost their jobs or are experiencing financial instability.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I like a lot of what you're saying there, both of you. And I really like that analogy around, when it comes to mental health, the pilots don't necessarily have the maps of the mountains or know their proximity to the mountains either. So there is that real focus on both the tertiary, like you say, the reactive approaches, and the individual approaches without looking at the systemic or workplace design factors that are contributing to poor mental health.
Yeah, and a big part of that, what we're increasingly looking at now, is culture, which is the bedrock of social interaction and behaviors. So we have some interesting statistics arising from our research. One is that only 1 in 4 aviation workers would willingly disclose a mental health problem. So this is partly a cultural issue at an organizational level, as well as, where you look at stigma around mental health. So these things do need to be addressed. And the organization has a responsibility in terms of setting the tone and the behaviors for people, and they are followed. So if you feel that, disclosing a mental health issue is going to become a problem for you, both professionally and interpersonally with your colleagues, well, then you're less likely to do that. If you feel supported and you feel that the organization cares about your well-being, is interested in gathering data about challenges that people are experiencing so that they can improve organizational processes, whether it's improving rostering, well, then you're more likely to disclose it, and that stands to reason.
Mm-hmm.
So you've given us a little bit of a summary of what you're working on at the moment. Can you go into that in a bit more detail, sort of your methodology and what you've been finding so far?
Yeah, we can. And it's also important to point out, it's not just mental health that we're looking at. We've used the biopsychosocial framework to create what we call the lived experience model of a pilot. And we looked at the 3 factors: your physical, your mental, and your social health. Because it's not even just the mental health of the pilots, it's also their families, and how being a pilot or an aviation worker affects those around us. And as a father of 2 teenage girls, it particularly worries me that I came across a paper there a couple of years ago, and in it they described how teenage daughters of shift workers are at a heightened risk of developing depression. That horrified me. And I think it should also horrify a lot of my colleagues. I don't know whether there's any evidence base, but there's certainly anecdotal evidence. I look at a lot of my colleagues who seem to have daughters rather than sons, and I don't know why it is that pilots seem to have a higher number of female children than male children. There's a joke in the industry that we call ourselves sissy mickeys, in that we're not able to spawn a son. It's normally a female. So if we're all shift workers and we're producing more females than males, that doesn't bode very well for the mental health of our children. But to get back to how we started developing the research, that diary that I brought that to Joan, and we created what we call this lived experience model. It's a massive mind map of, we looked at how sources of work-related stress resulted in health outcomes, well, possible pathways for health outcomes. And we were also assisted by a professor of clinical psychology, Dr. Keith Gaynor. And the 3 of us constructed this model. And then we held a series of workshops with pilots where we tried to validate this model. and also to see how it relates to safety. And in those workshops, we came up with 6 possible scenarios. The most common scenario was where pilots tended to be doing okay. There was no health implications, and as a result, there was no safety implications. And we believe that that was the most common. And then the least common was the Germanwings type scenario, the exceptionally rare but the highly catastrophic events that get all the attention and got such focus from EASA, the European regulator, bringing in all those rules that I spoke about. They're exceptionally rare. And to put it into context, like Germanwings wasn't the only deliberate destruction of an aircraft. I've counted back since the early 80s, and I found roughly 8 similar accidents. But in that same time period, there was 1,600 fatal accidents. So that's 99.5% of accidents were not caused deliberately. But we do know that 80% of those 99.5% of accidents had a human factors element in it. So we ask, well, what was the human factors element? What was it that caused the human error? And we would argue that we can't estimate the percentage, but there has to be a significant number that were caused by pilots' state of mind or their mental health. So we feel that we need to look at the broader level of suffering, the more common suffering, not the person who's seriously distressed and is going to deliberately destroy an airplane, but someone who's coming to work with baggage, who's struggling. And those scenarios, the first one I said, that was the one we reckoned was most common. However, our data now suggested it mightn't actually be. That the next scenario was people who are possibly struggling with some sort of health issue. It could be a little bit of anxiety, a bit of depression, a bit of back pain, but it doesn't have a safety implication. The third one was where someone does have a problem and it has the potential to cause a safety issue, but generally it's picked up by, the mistake is picked up by their colleague. And then the fourth and the fifth relate to where people's health issues are so bad that they've withdrawn from work. So there's no real safety implication. But we argue that rather than looking at that 6th scenario, the final one where people deliberately destroy aircraft, you need to look at the third one where people's health is affecting their performance, because our well-being, whether it's physical or mental well-being, it is a performance shaping factor, and it does affect how we perform in the cockpit. And there could be a day where something gives and that mistake that I make or one of my colleagues makes is just not picked up, and it does lead to a fatal accident. And we believe that those 99.5% of accidents, some of those could have been caused by scenario 6. And that's where we think the focus needs to be now. After those series of workshops, sorry, Joan, do you want to cut in there?
Yeah, no, just to say, and I think it might be of interest to your listeners. So depending on the area that you work in, I mean, you know, your listeners may be most familiar with occupational health and safety, but a particular feature of our methodology is we're taking a human factors systems approach, and it blends aspects that you would look at typically in occupational health and science. But we're looking, you know, across process, culture, training, technologies, people, values, and we're taking this systems approach. And as part of that, we're looking at, you know, problem framing. And initially our research, as Paul mentions, the interviews that he undertook with pilots, and then the workshops that we did, we focused on pilots, and then we moved out to focus on other aviation workers. And then we start to build the kind of systems level, and talk to, you know, people who are responsible for safety management in airlines, and people involved in training, and people involved in procuring new technologies, or gathering evidence. And it's to get this kind of multi-stakeholder perspective. And I think this is, you know, the problem of improving well-being for aviation workers and building a well-being and safety culture is that you need to take different stakeholders' perspectives into account. You can't just simply focus on individual groups of workers. You know, you need to look across the organization in different roles, and some people have different and conflicting goals and needs. So it needs to, you know, any kind of evidence picture and any kind of solution needs to look at the different sides. And I think that's something that we've been doing. And I hope that it makes it more amenable and accessible, because it's a rich evidence set then, you know, and it's multi-stakeholder and it's across the systems perspective. So it's not just looking at the worker level, you know. And I think it's important for people to understand that. And I imagine at the moment, lots of aviation organisations are feeling even more nervous about problems of managing health and well-being. And this doesn't even include the thorny issues around mental health, just general health and well-being, with staff that are quite depleted, that are, on reduced wages, with such uncertainty to the future. So it's important to see that we actually are looking at the different perspectives, and that these are being factored and taken into consideration. And we're interested in understanding why a safety manager looks at health and well-being in a certain way. What are the barriers to addressing well-being as a risk in a safety management system? Why is it difficult to communicate about these kinds of risks and make changes to rostering? So it's getting at this level. Now, the lived experience is where it needs to start. And, the lived experience, and this comes from phenomenology and Aryan philosophy, where you look about how being in the world and what it's like to be in the world. In our case, we're looking at being in the world as the homework interface and the experience of the job. And many of the factors that we looked at are very much similar to what typically in occupational health and safety, you look at psychosocial factors. But we were extending it because a lot of these factors interrelate with physical health factors. And then you also have to look at individual differences and people's coping abilities. And, in some of in the work system models that are out there, they do look at, a person's resources to cope with, job demands. So not just the organizational resources, the person's individual resources. And we've seen evidence of variability there. And we need to understand, well, how can we enhance people's own resources, but also how can an organization provide better resources and support their workers? And how can organizations be supported in transforming to this new way of doing things? Because we can't just expect organizations to make these leaps, and massive cultural leaps, massive leaps in terms of how they, a humane reaction and treatment of well-being and mental health. They need to be supported too, and it's a journey.
That's really interesting, and I'm pleased with, I guess, the breadth of focus that you're taking in your research, and that you're not just sort of honing in on just the pilots themselves and their psychological state, but you're actually looking at them as one component of an overall system that's, that is a complex adaptive system, being
Absolutely.
the aviation industry.
Yeah.
And I think, framing that within that context is really important. I mean, we have talked a little bit about human factors perspectives on this podcast, and that's my background as well. We had Tim Marsh on recently, so he was talking about his blue pie model, which probably aligns sort of fairly closely with what Paul was just talking about in terms of how impaired a pilot might be from a distress perspective, and how that impacts on performance overall.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there is lots of positives in some of the research that we've been doing, and I think we're very keen to look at both the positives and the negatives. From both our surveys that we've done, both the first survey was in 2018 and 19, and it had 1,050 respondents, and the second had over 2,000. And in both cases, we found that aviation workers, initially the first survey was with pilots, but the second was with a range of aviation workers. 60% are using adaptive coping strategies, which is really positive, and they are practicing resilient and healthy behaviors. And their organizations need to embrace this and support this, but we found other things that are quite alarming, particularly since COVID. We found that 92% of aviation workers are looking for supports, but only 23% have received supports. So there certainly is a problem with the wellbeing culture with aviation organizations at a time when there's a profound need for assistance and support, this very crucial time, and this assistance isn't being provided. So that is quite alarming. And we've also found that, of those organizations I mentioned, 23% that are providing supports, a very small number, only 24%, are availing of those supports. So the actual supports that, when they are provided, aren't actually meeting the need. So we need to look at, well, what is the best way to provide support, and that support to promote positive well-being, but also to support those who are suffering and experiencing changes in their life that are affecting their health and well-being. And also organizations need to understand, well, what they need to do to change. So there, if you like, their service offering in terms of EAPs, and then whether they have peer support or any kind of assistance systems, are they actually working, and are they being used, and in what way do they provide benefits, and how could we enhance the benefits, you know, because there is a certain amount of appetite, there is some systems at play that are there, so how can these be augmented to actually meet the need?
Yeah. Yeah, no, we're particularly interested in this podcast on one element of your research, which is around the design of work and psychological hazards, if you like. So obviously the pandemic, and we'll talk more about the effects of the pandemic on psych hazards and risk within the aviation industry in a moment. But historically, what are some of the psych hazards that are most prevalent within the airline industry?
I'll take that, if that's okay, Jason. Traditionally, the main hazards would have been associated with shift work and the nature of the job, the fact that we fly long flights. Like, unfortunately, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, we can't bring them together, and airplanes can only fly so fast. So long duties, jet lag, it's just part and parcel of the job. We can't get rid of that, but there are some factors that we can. And in our 2018 study, in which we surveyed over 1,000 pilots, we asked them to identify sources of work-related stress that they believed were negatively impacting on their health or worsening existing health issues. And the most common one was irregular hours. Now, unfortunately, we can't do much about that. Like 66% of pilots complained about irregular hours. But as I said, that's the nature of the job. If we have an issue with that, we're in the wrong job. The next one, at 56%, was divergence of values between management and staff. That certainly can be addressed. After that, at 56%, was antisocial hours. Once again, can't do much about that. At 54%, difficulties accessing fresh food and eating processed food the whole time. That can certainly be addressed. 53% of people complained about long duties. Once again, long haul flights, we can't make them any shorter. Roster uncertainty at 52%, that can be addressed. 49.6% of pilots complained about lack of annual leave when they wanted it, that they couldn't get holidays when their kids were off school, because that's when everyone wants to go on holidays, so pilots need to fly. The airlines could easily just hire enough pilots that we could also get holidays during the summer. At 42% was lack of engagement. That can be addressed. The changing nature of the job, 42%. Well, that's probably a little bit more difficult to change. Time away from home was raised by 38% of pilots, and 28% of pilots complained of increased responsibility while authority and support was reducing. So there are factors that can be addressed. They're within the control of the organization. We've mentioned depression and burnout, or say depression and anxiety and suicide, but what hasn't been mentioned is burnout. And in our study in 2018, we measured levels of burnout, and 80%, that's 80%, 4 out of 5 pilots met the threshold for moderate burnout. But we saw a positive correlation that when stuff like, we looked at the 13 factors that the Canadians have identified in their standard: organization culture, workload, you know, the 13 factors. We looked at all 13. Every single one, there was a direct relationship. When those factors improved, the levels of burnout reduced, which demonstrates that the airlines can handle this. This can be solved. It's not impossible. So there is a role that the organizations can play. Now, we also saw the role that the pilots can play. And like, not every pilot was playing their part. If you think of the Swiss cheese model, we look at sleep as been one layer. So pilots who focused on getting good sleep, pilots who focused on getting a reasonable amount of exercise each week, and pilots who focused on having a good diet, and also pilots who had a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning in their life, they had a much better chance of not struggling with depression. So the pilots have a role to play. but the organizations also have a role to play. And like a lot of things in aviation, it's a joint responsibility.
Yeah, and that's something we talk about frequently on the podcast, the shared responsibility model. And as we've discussed at length, a lot of the responsibility is just put on the individual at the moment, and the workplace or employer not taking enough responsibility for the things like you say, which are directly within their control. It's interesting that researchers like yourself have to go and find out this stuff, because I doubt that there'd be many airline companies who would actually be brave enough at the moment to do this in sort of investigation themselves. I mean, it's definitely something that we've seen, like, there are people concerned that if they ask the question, then they have to do something, right? Because they're going to find the source of the problem. But like you say, a lot of them, it's not like they don't cost a lot. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there for organizations to address.
Yeah, I think there is.
I mentioned the Canadian standards. I mentioned the Canadian standards. I spoke to some of my colleagues in some of the major airlines in Canada, assuming that they'd have this stuff sorted. And they said, sorry, the Canadian what? They'd never heard of the Canadian standards.
Yeah. There's still a lot of obviously competence and communication that we need to build up. Yeah. Sorry, Joan.
Yeah, but I think in terms of there's education as well on both sides. So with the responsibilities that we say, so organizations and individuals have responsibilities. Organizations actually need to see that there's some things that they can do, that there's some areas that they can intervene in that will have positive outcomes, so whether it's reducing burnout or the experience of stress, or improving the overall lived experience and well-being, and that these aren't insurmountable, and that they, and this will be the start of improving the kind of relations between staff and management, and equally individuals need to understand, that their role. And a funny thing that we've wondered when we've been collecting evidence, and I've often thought about this, so we've asked people in each of our surveys, about coping strategies, and we've given examples, and sometimes it isn't obvious to people that actually what they're doing is a coping strategy. So you're feeling stress, you go for a walk, but if you actually understand that actually delivers benefits, so continue to do that is something that's positive. That we sometimes do things unconsciously and unknowingly, and we may not even be aware of the direct relationship between health benefits and having a chat with a friend. So this education piece, so the things that aviation workers can do for themselves, they're likely already doing. It's just to enhance them, or to build routines around them, or to continue to do them. So it's that kind of health education and health promotion piece as well, and that's not to shift the emphasis off organizations, because I think the evidence that we have at the moment is aviation workers are doing a lot, organizations are doing very little. And both parties should not be feeling powerless, because there are really straightforward opportunities for both parties to this problem. The regulator is slightly different, because the regulation is part of this problem too. And one thing that I would be really interested to do is, and we can talk about this again, is looking at gathering evidence using technologies and making information about well-being, de-identified information, available to the regulator, so they actually see what's going on. Because I think the regulator needs to understand this too, not just organizations and not just workers, to really understand the scope of this and what factors are at play. So when they look at their recommendations around peer support and preventing maladaptive behaviors like substance abuse, and alcohol and drugs, that there's other things that they should be looking at. And equally, aeromedical examiners should be coaching aviation workers, particularly those at the in safety critical roles, to practice stress management activities, to engage in healthy behaviors, and maybe to gather an evidence base for themselves to see, well, what kinds of behaviors work for people who are involved in shift work, who have these particular sources of work-related stress that make certain types of healthy lifestyles difficult to maintain, or require a certain level of balance, or require a bit more effort. Like if you could wake up each day and have someone to nudge you to say, right, this morning, Joan, I think you've got 10 minutes. Why don't you do some meditation? Or this morning, Joan, you're going to have a very long day and you had very little sleep last night. If you had a personal assistant. Now, we don't all have people to do this first, but potentially we can use artificial systems and technologies and gather information and learn about people's behavior to provide this kind of supportive assistant function to get the right behavior out of people. And equally, this kind of information piece could be used by organizations to learn about the culture that's going on, to learn about the social and health behaviors of their staff and where they need supports and what the lived experience is like. You know, the maps that we developed of the lived experience, you know, are universal, it seems, for most aviation workers. And I think they could translate quite well to frontline health workers, you know, to lots of different professions, but particularly those where there's, you know, less latitude in terms of managing your roster and your schedule, and less control and less autonomy, which we know is a you know, a psychosocial risk, if you like. And I think that if you were to look at that and then look at, well, where that map and what can the organization do, you know, there's so much to learn from the lived experience, and there's so much that could be improved. So there's a great opportunity. So, you know, although it may sound that we're saying, you know, there's you know, there's suffering and these areas aren't being addressed, we actually, the story is also that it is available to organizations to change this, and it's not that complex. Having said that, I think looking at well-being risk within a safety management system is a little bit more complex, and looking at how you use evidence to change things and to manage operations, and I mean routine operations, because there's that affects the bottom line, and it affects you know, profit and decisions around, you know, is someone, you know, working today or not, you know, and these kinds of things. So if you really want to invest in your workers' quality of life and the home work interface, you know, there is an implication there. It's going to cost you, you know, but then the result is you have engaged staff, you know, you have staff with less burnout, you know, they're not exhausted, they're more likely to go the extra mile, they're also more likely to engage in adaptive behaviors, because we've seen a relationship between staff who are valued and adaptive behaviors, and they're more likely to tell you when there's a problem, so you know, to avoid presenteeism, and also better health, reduce absenteeism, you know, and these are all things that companies care about because it affects their bottom line, it affects money, and they're interested in money, they're interested in health, but they're very interested in money.
Well, I would argue that in aviation, they're not really interested in health, and that culture needs to change. One of your guests a couple of weeks back, Clive Lloyd, spoke about knuckle draggers and the impact of an employer's actions and attitudes towards their staff. What doesn't help is when we have CEOs who publicly call out their pilots as a bunch of glorified bus drivers, which has happened. I'm not going to mention any names. What also doesn't happen is when senior managers address their cabin crew and tell them that in terms of a career, they can forget about it, that the role of a cabin crew is a gap year job for gap year students. Now, thankfully, when Sully landed his aircraft in the Hudson, he didn't have 3 gap year students in the back of the aircraft. In fact, he had 3 cabin crew who, between the 3 of them, had over 100 years experience of being cabin crew. And it was that life experience that got all those passengers out of that aircraft alive. Sully put them into the river, but they got them out of the aircraft safely. So I think how we address and how we treat our staff, that impacts safety, and the culture needs to be looked at. And as we know, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And in that fight, downward facing dog doesn't stand a chance. You know, we cannot treat these problems with, you know, banana and yoga. You know, you put this guy into aviation, he's going to struggle too. You know, like we need meaningful supports and not random acts of wellness. And that's not happening. Like recipes for chicken and lentil soup, it just makes no difference. We need to look at the factors, the ones I mentioned, addressed in the Canadian standards, the type of stuff that's going to be addressed in ISO 45003. That's desperately needed in aviation now.
Yeah, we're working, doing some research alongside some great colleagues in the European Aviation Safety Authority, and they've developed a lot of new messaging for aviation workers. And, one aspect of the messaging is saying that, well-being isn't about, fruit bowls and yoga. And, it's really good messaging because it communicates the purpose that well-being needs to be built into everything the organization does, and equally what people do in terms of how they act. So whether they disclose issues. So it needs to be embedded. And if you think about that word embedded, what does it mean? It means right in there. It's part of everything. It's not alongside. And that's challenging, but that's what it needs to be. And this issue with culture, people run away from culture because they say everything is culture. So we can't change culture. Well, yes, you can change culture. And the first thing that needs to be changed is reporting, disclosure. One of the interesting things that we found is that colleagues, are a huge source of support for other aviation workers because they know what it's like. So your partner may care for you and have all the best intentions, but they don't walk in your shoes because they're not doing your job. So they don't really understand what it's like in the juggling. They experience, no doubt, the consequences your job has for the homework interface, as do the family. And Paul mentioned that research around daughters of pilots who are of shift workers who are, experiencing higher levels of depression. So they do experience it, but we need to look at that, and shifting culture and shifting reporting and colleagues providing a source of support. So how can we enable that beyond peer support, where there's more open discussion? And one of these things that we're looking at is the culture in terms of briefings in the, whether it's a cockpit or it's with cabin crew, where you can put your hand up and say, I've had a really tricky week, and I'm doing research around culture across different organizations and industries. So in healthcare, actually, equally, the culture is pretty appalling in terms of, you expect health workers to, who are all about protecting health, to talk about their well-being and if they're having a bad day, and they don't. So this is not new. This is, people tend to not disclose these things, but an open atmosphere and briefing around this helps people support each other. And it's that support. And we find this where you ask about, well, how does work-related stress and well-being issues affect safety? It's that support which protects safety. So, that if you know that your colleague isn't doing so well, or even if you don't know, but you sense something, you're kind of unconsciously acting to help them, or there's an extra level of oversight. And we need that in operations. But going back to the point of it being embedded, so it needs to be embedded in rostering. It needs to be embedded in the sources of work-related stress that Paul identified, better food, these kinds of things that can easily change. So well-being is in everything. And there's some things like long-haul flights that, you can't change. But maybe you can look at, you can't address every source of stress, but those ones that you have control over, well, that gives you an opportunity. And actually, if some other sources of stress are alleviated or addressed, well, then maybe you can cope better with the ones that are less likely to change. So if you feel there's a culture of support, well, then that helps you cope. And I think we've seen this in, psychological safety climate surveys. There's evidence that where, the psychological or the safety climate is good, that, there's performance is better, safety is better, colleagues feel more supported, colleagues are more likely to support each other. So all these kinds of things we want for safety outcomes, not just for well-being outcomes. Obviously, well-being is at the centre, but we do have to look at those safety outcomes as well and look at the kind of big picture.
But I think just to finish on that, culture will only change from one direction, and that's from the top. And there's too many airlines that are afraid to speak about mental health. Like I know of cases where the word mental health, depression, anxiety, they're not allowed to be used. Fluffy words like well-being are used instead. So like mental health in those institutions is a dirty word. And that's why in those organizations, the silence, people aren't talking about it. That's why in so many airlines, the uptake of peer support programs and EAP is in the single-digit percentages. That's why in those airlines, approximately 3 out of every 4 staff won't disclose a mental health issue. So that conversation, that culture needs to start from the top. I was very encouraged earlier this year. I was actually gobsmacked, to be honest, not just encouraged. I was floored when I read that the CEO of British Airways, an Irish man called Sean Doyle, he came out and he said that together we can end mental health discrimination. Today, British Airways has taken part in the Time to Talk Day because we know that just one small conversation can make a big difference. That was the man at the top. Later that day, his chief pilot, his director of flight operations, Alistair Bridger, came out and made a similar statement. So that statement is profound to his pilots, as opposed to silence from so many other organizations that just say nothing, push it to the corner. We don't want to talk about that. So the culture needs to change. Otherwise, everything that we've spoken about is pointless.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So and it does put it up to leaders to change, and to it's not just to have the appetite, but to walk the talk. So they too need to, not just say that as far as they need to speak about their own challenges, and be authentic. British Airways, excellent example, but there's few of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I guess, that's sort of leading the way then and setting the example for other airlines. So it will be interesting to see what happens in the future and whether other airlines sort of take on that almost that challenge that British Airways have thrown down then in relation to mental health. I'd like to explore a little bit more, if we can, the relationship between psychological distress and flight safety. Paul, you spoke about that a little bit earlier. Could you go into a bit more detail about that for us?
I don't have much else to say other than what we said, that I think the focus is wrong. The focus currently is on the prevention of another Germanwings type event, which really, it's so rare. It's so exceptionally rare. Yet when you have a situation where 80% of pilots potentially are meeting the threshold for moderate burnout, when you have a situation where, I have the figure here in front of me, about 25% at the moment of pilots are meeting the threshold for clinical depression, that has to have an impact on safety. Now, I would like to point out that those figures on depression, they're not all that far from the general population. It's within 1 or 2%. But 80% of pilots meeting the threshold for moderate burnout. And the fact that we know that burnout is more a systemic issue. It's more caused in the workplace than outside of work. That's where my concern would be.
Yeah. We also have, so when we looked at, we have burnout, we also have exhaustion and disengagement. 85% are meeting the threshold for moderate disengagement. So disengagement affects, whether you follow procedures and overall procedural compliance. It also affects whether you support your colleagues and take an interest in your colleagues. It affects communication behaviors, whether you report near misses. All these things that we know are important from a safety culture perspective, which contribute to safety levels. So it's that kind of systems perspective as well. The other thing that I would say is, the question is, if you look at, well, how does work-related stress or well-being challenges affect safety? We also want to find out, well, how does positive well-being enhance safety? And this needs to be asked, and we have evidence to say that the flip side, and I think that's where, where in terms of mindset and attitudes, that's where, British Airways are getting it right in terms of looking at this, because if you can actually promote positive well-being and promote discussion around well-being, including well-being challenges, well, then you can say, well, we're trying to enhance safety, and we're trying to enhance well-being to build safety, and good well-being delivers benefits across the board. So it's this framing it negatively, and equally not looking at the benefits of coping and supporting your workers, and the benefits of disclosure, and the benefits of promoting psychological safety and healthy discussion around well-being and challenges. So going back to those statistics of 1 in 4 only that would only willingly disclose a mental health issue to an employer. Having said that, we know around 68% will seek help. So they're just not seeking help from their organizations. And, I've thought about this quite a bit as to, what is the role of organizations? I mean, if you have a problem, who should you be talking to about your problem? And obviously some health problems impact upon performance. So of course the organization needs to know, but they need to know in a way that is going to enable a constructive conversation to support someone to keep them working. Because you actually don't want people off work or not working. You want people to continue to work and to be enabled by an experience where they have disclosed and got support. And that's really where I think, employers' priorities should be, about promoting well-being and enabling these conversations and walking the talk in terms of embedding well-being in everything in operational and organizational processes.
I spoke a little while ago about the fallacy of the right stuff and how we believe that pilots should have the right stuff. However, I do believe it's possible to cultivate and nurture the right stuff in pilots. And when you think of Darwin and the survival of the fittest, it's not the strongest who survive, it's those who adapt best to their environment. And this abnormal environment that pilots have to work in, of which some of the factors can't be changed, we can, by identifying where the hazards are and enabling our pilots and equipping them with the right skills to adapt to that environment and to thrive and to flourish in that environment. And I think that's where we now need to look at, and how do we give our pilots the right stuff to operate in this abnormal environment so that foreseeable harm is prevented. And I think if we can do that, we can tie up well-being with improving flight safety.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And there's definitely that combined piece, right? Working on the individual and their ability to adapt and cope to less than ideal situations, which are often outside of anyone's control. Like you say, you can't reduce the duration of long haul flights, unfortunately. But then we also need to look at the employer's side and what they can do to address systems that might be causing preventable work-related stress. But I guess some of the things we've been talking about, or the majority of the things we've been talking about, are issues that predated the pandemic. Now, arguably, the aviation industry is one of the hardest hit industries due to the pandemic and the restriction on flights. So what are some of the main issues now that are contributing to pilot stress and flight staff stress, I guess? And what's the aviation industry doing about it?
Well, up until COVID, our main focus was on pilots. We had wanted to extend the focus to other groups, but COVID afforded us an opportunity to do so. At the start of the pandemic, over the course of a weekend or two, we produced a booklet called Turbulent Times. And it wasn't a scientific piece. It was just a small little pamphlet with about 20 pages in it. If you want, we can give it to you and you can put it in the show notes. It was a booklet that we used some of the findings from our 2018 study, where we looked at the factors that were helping pilots be resilient. And this was a booklet mainly for pilots to help them deal with COVID and the lockdown. That booklet has been downloaded over 50,000 times. It's been picked up by many airlines around the world, including British Airways, Qantas, down your neck of the woods, a lot of the main carriers around the world, and distributed to their staff. 50,000 downloads. On foot of that, we were invited to work with the Flight Safety Foundation, and we helped producing a second document, the Aviation Professionals Guide to Wellbeing. And then on foot of that, we got picked up by EASA. And we've spent the last few months working with EASA and looking at how COVID is impacting people. We did a study in August. It was a snapshot 3-week study. We got over 2,000 aviation workers. Most of them were pilots, followed then by cabin crew, engineers, and air traffic controllers were the 4 main groups. And we looked at several different things, but we knew that studies had been done in the general population and that certain sociodemic risk factors had been identified. The first one being age. Younger people were more likely to suffer than older people. Basically, COVID wasn't the older people's first rodeo. This is not my first crisis in aviation. I've been through 9/11, the volcanic ash, the crash of 2018. Someone who's newer in the industry, the bottom has fallen out of their world, basically. Females were more likely to suffer than males in the general population. And thirdly, those who were financially impacted by the pandemic, they were also more likely. So when people say we're all in the same boat, that's nonsense. We're not. We're all weathering the same storm. But some of us are in cruise liners and other people are hanging onto a piece of wood. They're drowning. So not all aviation workers are suffering the same. But when we looked at the different groups, like pilots, for COVID, we found that 28% of pilots, so that's the wrong figure that I'm looking at, 25% of pilots were meeting the threshold for clinical depression. However, 58% of cabin crew were meeting the threshold for clinical depression, compared to 17% of air traffic controllers. Now, when you look at those groups and you look at the breakdown, 90% of the pilots who took part in the study were male. 25% of the cabin crew were male. The age profile, most of the cabin crew were younger. Most of the pilots were older. And then in terms of job impact, far more cabin crew have been laid off, whereas pilots have been either furloughed or put on reduced salary, because when the industry picks up again, it'll be a lot easier to recruit and retrain cabin crew than it will to train a pilot. And then a lot of air traffic controllers, not all air traffic controllers, but a lot are employed by the state. So they were never going to lose their job. They have security. So that's what I mean, that not everyone is experiencing the same levels of distress. And then even within the pilots or within the cabin crew, you can definitely see that those younger are the ones who are in a worse state and they need more support than the older ones. So what's the airline industry doing about it? Not a whole lot that I can see. Chicken soup.
Yeah, so the response has been very poor. So we mentioned, 23% of aviation workers saying that they've got supports. Now you have to frame this in terms of, what kind of supports would be acceptable. And, if someone has lost their job and they do want their job back, what is the ability within the airline to provide that? So that's one part of the conversation, to provide security. But the second thing is the nature of the supports, and is there a distance? Is it warm? How are supports provided? So we did ask, and around 600 people gave responses as to 23% gave responses that they were having supports. Only 24% said that they were actually availing of those. But the kinds of supports they were getting were things like information bulletins as to what is going on, with the airline. Information bulletins are presentations around managing stress. A very small number got one-to-one Zoom calls with their line managers, to ask them how they were doing. So something kind of more warm and interpersonal, and a kind of a reaching out. So, the response I would characterize as, for those who've provided support, has been very distant and kind of quite cold. It hasn't been very embracing or warm, and supportive in the sense of that, those kind of interpersonal dynamics where you talk to someone on an individual basis and you ask them, well, how are you doing? And that doesn't have to happen for a very long period of time. A few minutes of a line captain asking you, how are you doing, means a lot, and brings with it a whole culture and a whole prioritization and a value scheme, but this isn't happening, and that's disappointing. And I suppose airlines and other aviation organizations are, preoccupied with staying financially afloat and dealing with this crisis. So, they are behaving, their organizations, but they're behaving like individuals in crisis, which is typically short-termist. And we are all hoping for a recovery, and a recovery will require healthy staff who have been supported and have been brought on the journey as a recovery journey, not being left to crash and burn and then expected to be fit for work, and come back with zero scars. So this is how they need to be thinking. But of course it's short term. It's because they're in crisis. The house is on fire. What do they do? So you do have to moderate it with some understanding at an organization level, but I wouldn't excuse what is going on. But this preventative and proactive approach just isn't happening. And so even if you look at how they're reaching out or they are gathering evidence as to how their staff are doing, they're not doing that. Like our survey is a piece of evidence around how aviation workers are doing during COVID, and it's only for a short timestamp. Are aviation organisations talking to their staff? Are they surveying them? Are they asking them about sources of stress, where their well-being is at? Are they using coping mechanisms? All these things that they could do, they're not doing, and they could do remotely quite easily. So that, I mean, that begs some questions about priorities. So there certainly is a way to go there.
Yeah.
I think
and you'd say, they've got the short-term thinking because of the financial impacts, obviously, on the aviation industry. But COVID's been around now for more than a year, the impacts, right?
Yes.
They've had time to think about this now. So what does the future look like then in terms of the aviation industry and for the people working in it?
I can't answer that question, Jason. I knew you were going to ask that question, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I don't know. There's so much uncertainty. I don't know which airlines are going to get through. I don't know what the future of aviation is going to look like. I don't know, will we ever see business travel again to the level we did? Will there be such pent-up demand for holidays that we'll be absolutely floored? I just don't know. I don't know. But what I do know is that whenever we do get back flying, it's going to be a very vulnerable and broken workforce that's coming back in. So I just hope the airlines have a plan for that. I don't know what that plan is. I haven't seen a plan, but I hope there's a plan because they're going to need it.
And like, even if you just park the uncertainty around, COVID and having, going back to the levels of passengers and numbers of flights that we had prior to COVID. So looking at the kind of financial side, if you say, well, are airlines going to behave in the way British Airways have recently behaved and prioritizing well-being and talking about a change in values and the leadership expressing this, I think the future depends upon that. I think it depends on a change in culture. But the thing is, like any relationship, you to trust and to have credibility, you need to earn it. And the stock is very low at the moment. So, they haven't earned credibility or trust by how some of the behaviors during COVID and prior to COVID. So it's a big ask, but so they really need to move with this and change culture and have an appetite for it. And I think, and link it into the actual business model, and how operations work, and really look at that. And I think it's not a question as to, like how individual airlines and will they cope. It's the aviation industry. Are they coming together with the regulator and with all the vested parties and insurers and everyone to actually look at this and look at protecting staff and protecting safety and having well-being at the center, and dealing with a workforce. So the human capital, that has been eroded to an extent by COVID, but also a human capital where 60% are using coping strategies, where 68% have said they would look for help if they had a problem, who have an interest in their health and want to protect their health and also want to protect their families and have a job, So, there's a motivation there, a huge intrinsic motivation for staff to be healthy and have jobs, as well as there is for organizations to be successful. It's just to figure out, well, how does success look with well-being at its center? What is success in that sense? And that needs to be unpacked. But I think it's a question for other industries as well, not just aviation, but obviously aviation is particularly affected.
So Joan, that leads quite nicely into the next question that I wanted to ask you. So your background is in philosophy. Would you like to make some comments on the ethics of psychological health and safety in the aviation industry?
Yeah, I suppose my main point is looking at roles and responsibilities. So in ethics, where you look at a value basis and you look at duties, and this has been a thorny issue to understand what are the roles and responsibilities. And there's a few things I would like to point to. So the Tripartite Labour Coalition, so they look at, concepts of responsible work, and the ethics being that organisations don't just have responsibilities to their shareholders, they have responsibilities to their staff, but also to society. So this goes back to the problem framing and looking at the impact of well-being issues on aviation workers' families and on aviation worker communities. Okay. The second thing is around the triple bottom line. So, all work needs to deliver benefits, and all business and organizations need to behave in the context of the triple bottom line. So that's looking at, people, profit and planet. Now, it's a tricky one for aviation organizations when you bring in the planet. And I know there's lots that they've been doing to improve fuel and these kinds of things, but particularly around protecting people, and having a balance across these three areas of benefits. So it seems the direction is, more around profit than people and less around planet. So if you look at psychological health and well-being, and you look at changing health and well-being and safety culture, you need to put people at the center. And the ethics is about, what is the starting point, and how are you framing the problem, and how are you looking at responsibilities, and how is that being divvied up. And then the last thing that I would look at, like we're very interested in well-being, but in particular psychological well-being, and looking at quality of life, and the homework interface and those aspects. And the OECD has looked at one of the factors for quality of life is the management of the homework interface. And we would say that there's a whole aspect of social justice built into this. So you have the homework interface, you have the right to work, a protected job, safety in work, all these aspects, and that there's a kind of a social justice dimension to that, and that needs to be understood and framed. So when you're looking at all aspects of well-being, you need to frame it from this social justice and decent work perspective. And I know they are international labour organisations since 1998 have promoted this decent work agenda. I don't think aviation organisations have been listening to this. And I think now when you look at psychosocial risk factors, some aspects of the decent work agenda are in there. When you look at autonomy and latitude and workload, and protection of health, and protection from psychosocial stress. But, really look at, well, what does decent work mean? I have huge concerns around the growth of the gig economy. And one of the things that we look at gig workers who are really suffering from massive psychosocial stress, from lack of job security, and from uncertainty in their work. And this is moving in. Some of what we see with COVID for aviation workers is precisely this issue. And I wonder when there is a recovery where there's a strong focus on profit and recovering profit, will there be a less of a focus on people and aspects of the job that link to decent work? And will there be a movement towards kind of gig worker models? And this is where you need to look at the business model and how it works. And so all of this needs to be intertwined. You can't just have occupational health and safety, and safety management on one hand, and then look separately at flight operations processes, and look at rostering, and then look again separately at how you train people. All of it needs to be put together and linked in with the business model. And that's challenging, but that's the change that needs to happen. And that needs to happen within occupational health and safety as well, and how the ethical frame for it, with people at the centre.
Thank you, Joan. That's a very comprehensive overview.
You're welcome.
That probably leads nicely then into my next question for you both, which is, what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health within the aviation industry? And I might put that one to you, Paul.
I do really hope that psychological health and safety is taken seriously in aviation. I don't think health and safety, physical health and safety, has been a great concern for pilots, possibly for cabin crew when they look at the ergonomics and manual handling and lifting bags and stuff like that. But pilots, we've never really been given a look in. But I think now the time has come for psychological health and safety to be looked at.
Yeah, and how would that look, Paul, do you think?
Well, I think if you look at the 13 factors, if you were to start with the Canadian standard, and then when ISO 45003 hopefully comes out, if you look at those factors and start redesigning the work. Now, as I said, some of the things just won't change. We will always have long haul. We'll always have jet lag. That's just part and parcel. But how we interact and how the role of what we do is valued, and how we interact with our management, the levels of engagement, and the organizational culture. The culture has got to change. I think in terms of psychological health and safety, the culture is rotten. It's rotten to the core, and that needs to change from the top down.
Yeah. And ideally, just going back to it, I mean, your question was around like mental health, but you look at well-being and mental health as part of that. And equally, this biopsychosocial approach that we've been taking, that, you know, like we've seen that, sleep has a massive effect on mood and uptake of adaptive behaviors. So you have to look at the relationship across these pillars, and, psychosocial factors are very important, but just this big picture. And I think one of the benefits of what we're doing is having this lived experience approach and looking at all these different aspects and the interplay across factors. And I think that really needs to be done. I think it can be done, and we've got quite positive feedback about it, about its applicability. So, but looking at positive well-being as well, and who argue for this? They look for a positive definition of well-being, and that we're a glass half empty approach, and I think we need to remind ourselves, and this is partly the language we use, and the language needs to call out mental health, mental distress, but it also needs to call out positive well-being, positive psychological well-being, and things like behavior around organizational behavior, like is an organization warm, and do they care and how they behave, and the characteristics, and really look at that, because that impacts upon mental health, those behaviors. It's a relationship like any other, as I say, and I think
sorry, Joan.
Go ahead.
No, I think the lived experience has to be considered as opposed to the perceived or the imagined experience. I look at fatigue in aviation and how fatigue is managed. In Europe, we have a set of rules that were supposedly science-based. Back, I think it was about 2011, 2012, a panel of scientists were brought together by the European Commission to devise a science-based set of rules. By the time the rules were finally decided upon, after all the stakeholders had their input, what we had was a bastardized set of science-based rules that some of the scientists, in fact, actually stood back from and said, we're not standing over them, that they wouldn't even stand by the rules. So that's what we have. We have these pseudo-science-based set of rules for fatigue. And we can't have that same approach with psychological health and safety. I think it has to be real evidence. It has to be the lived experience, work as done, not work as imagined.
All right. Well, that probably gives me a hint as to what you're both going to respond to the next question, which is what words of advice do you have for professionals who would like to work in the field of psych health and safety in aviation?
Okay, I might take this one. So I suppose it's kind of really a wrap up on a lot that what we have said, So the first thing is, look at how you frame problems, and, engage with stakeholders, and not just necessarily those stakeholders who are realizing directly those problems or the consequences of those problems. Take a multi-stakeholder perspective, So again, a people-centric approach, but looking at all the people that are relevant. So be careful framing problems. Another thing is to gather evidence, and you can only change something when you've gathered evidence about it, and you can measure what's going on, and you can measure the benefits of change. And if you want to affect change in an organization, you need to start with something small and demonstrate the benefits of what you've done. So this requires measurement. So no matter what you do, you must measure. And just again, we keep reiterating this, but I can't emphasize enough this biopsychosocial approach and looking at the lived experience. But the last thing, and this is a very standard thing in human factors, not just to engage stakeholders, but to learn from implementation. So you learn about the problem as well as the solution when you implement something. Okay, so we spend a lot of time framing problems, and we do need to do that, and really get deep into, well, what is the problem? But then you still not need to move to looking at solutions. And when you move to solutions, you do learn more about the problem, because the solutions tell you why the problem exists, or why something isn't going to work as a solution because of some other aspects of the problem maybe that you haven't uncovered. So you learn so much from implementation, and there's a huge opportunity there. And people run a mile from implementation because they think we can't implement something until we've really solved it, or we know we've done the right thing. and we'll alienate stakeholders because we'll show ourselves to be unreliable, or that we've come up with something that is misguided. It's in fact, if you look at everything as a learning opportunity and as a way of getting evidence to improve something, then you won't be scared of implementation. So sometimes as an exercise in persuading other people about this, about the lessons learned from implementation. But good luck to anyone. It's a wonderful area and valuable area to work in. And one thing that we found, and it's come up in our research, having a purpose in life has a massive contribution to your well-being. And the work that we do, and we've had various different struggles over the years, gives huge purpose. So it's a reason to wake up in the morning and do something positive. So working in this area, you will deliver value. You'll be doing something that will help others. And isn't that a good thing? Isn't that a positive? So I think it's a very positive career. And, working with people, everyone says it's great to work with people, even in the difficult times, and someone working in this space, if they're doing their job well and are supported by the organization, they're dealing with people, and they're, whether they're interviewing people and learning about their lived experience, they're with people, for people, designing with and for people. And that's what you want. That's a reason to get up in the morning, as they say.
Yeah, no, purpose is so important. That's one of the reasons Joelle came and worked with us, of course.
Not that I didn't have purpose before when I was with the regulator. It's just
maybe more purpose now.
Different direction of purpose, potentially.
But in our own research, we found that people with higher, sense of purpose were much less inclined to be anxious or depressed. And had higher levels of subjective well-being as well. So purpose seems to be a really fundamental.
Yeah, but you have to moderate that with expectations, because we always say that we're in this for the long game, and in any kind of change program, it's been a very long game. So you kind of want to go with it and have resilience yourself, because you've plenty of barriers, and particularly in the space, if you're really looking at well-being in a deep way and looking at culture, and you're not just providing the yoga, you're going to be dealing with barriers, and plenty of them, and you need to be highly motivated, and you need to believe in the value of your work and be prepared to accept a certain amount of failure, in the sense that organizations are slow to change, and you need to kind of find ways around, and it'll be difficult, and you have to navigate that with other people.
And it certainly helps to be violently optimistic as well, I've been told.
Yeah, optimism is good.
Well, great, guys. It's been such a fantastic chat with both of you. You're both obviously very understanding and experienced within the aviation industry, and your research is obviously bleeding edge in the industry as well. So it's been a real pleasure having both of you on the show today.
Thank you. That's very gracious of you. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure too, guys. Thanks very much.
So that's it for the episode today, listeners. Don't forget, if you want to watch the video and see the lovely Joan and Paul on YouTube, you can check it out on the Flourish DX channel. Also, there's a heap of clips that we're going to be able to pull out of this, I think. Paul did have a couple of juicy bits that we'll have to drop into LinkedIn, and you'll be able to find them on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. He gives us I think a little bit of a scared look, Joan.
A little bit startled, yeah.
Yeah. But please check out the juicy bits that we share on the Flourish TX LinkedIn page. Also, you'll find that Joelle and myself are very active on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to us. And I see Paul dropping in a few of his words on LinkedIn as well. So he's actually a good one to follow if you don't connect with him directly. So that's it again, listeners, and thank you for today, and we'll catch you next episode.